Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a genuinely provocative analysis by an author named Zhu Feng. We're looking at the Bible, acknowledging its massive historical footprint, of course, but diving into a really controversial thesis. What if the God of the Old Testament is not actually the greatest creator? It's a huge, bold claim, so let's unpack exactly how the author builds this argument.
To do this, we'll map things out by first defining the greatest creator, then looking at Adam and Eve's betrayal, examining the 10 plagues, crunching a massive biblical timeline paradox, and finally getting to the author's final verdict.
Right. Let's start with part 1, defining the greatest creator. Before we can evaluate anything fairly, we need a rubric, right? Zhu Feng argues that a true greatest creator must universally possess 8 very specific traits. We're talking uniqueness and exclusivity, formlessness, neutrality, mystery, impartiality, mercy, supreme power, and supreme intelligence, which the author defines as establishing universal order and knowing both the past and the future. We're going to be using these 8 exact traits as our ultimate testing lens for the rest of this analysis. Okay, moving to part 2, Adam and Eve's betrayal. Let's put those traits of supreme power and intelligence to the ultimate test in the Garden of Eden. The text contrasts the idea of supreme foresight against what literally happens in Genesis. I mean, think about it. The author argues that God's inability to predict that his very first creations would immediately rebel shows a pretty distinct lack of foresight. If a supreme intelligence actually knows the future, how could it not foresee the actions of its own creations? And since they immediately broke the rules, Zhu Feng suggests this demonstrates a form of powerlessness, basically failing right out of the gate. Beyond just foresight, Zhu Feng really questions the divine fairness here, outlining 3 massive logical problems with banishing Adam and Eve. Number 1, if God created them, any flaw in their nature is basically a flaw in the original design. Number 2, they were tempted by Satan, a vastly superior supernatural force, yet the humans bore the punishment while the instigator walked free. And number 3, God intentionally planted that doomed tree of knowledge right in their living room. The author uses a really brilliant analogy for this. It's like an architect working incredibly hard to build a house, but the house just completely collapses the second it's finished, right onto his feet. Should the architect blame the bricks, or should he blame himself? Zhu Feng uses this to ask why the creator isn't held responsible for the flaw in his own creation. And that brings us to a huge question regarding the trait of mercy, the concept of original sin. Is it fair for over 100 billion people to bear the weight of original sin for a single mistake involving a planted tree? The author heavily challenges the logic here, arguing that making thousands of future generations pay for a stolen apple entirely defies the concept of mercy. Why not just start over?
Let's shift gears to part 3, the 10 plagues examined.
We're going to keep testing that trait of mercy against the dramatic events of the Exodus. When the Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, 10 plagues were unleashed, right? Well, Zhu Feng focuses heavily on the 10th and final plague, the killing of the firstborn of both people and livestock. While punishing a stubborn Pharaoh might seem logical, the author deeply questions the morality of bringing lethal disaster to innocent commoners, enslaved people with absolutely zero political power, and even animals. Does wiping out the innocent members of society really reflect divine mercy? But here is what's truly striking. The author pulls directly from Exodus 7:3 to show that God deliberately hardened the Pharaoh's heart. It wasn't just that Pharaoh was being stubborn on his own. God actually engineered that stubbornness. The text cites multiple verses where it is explicitly stated that the conflict was being prolonged on purpose, which leads Zhu Feng to pose a really sharp rhetorical question. If God encouraged the Israelites to leave, but actively force the Pharaoh's heart to resist them, does that reflect neutrality and mercy? Or does it look more like a two-faced schemer deliberately setting a trap just to create an excuse for punishment?
Okay, jumping into part 4, the biblical timeline paradox.
For this section, we're stepping away from morality entirely and looking purely at math and logic. If you calculate the genealogies and timelines provided directly in the Bible, you arrive at a very specific number. According to the text, the entirety of human history, from creation to today, spans only about 6,376 years. Let's trace that timeline to a huge genetic bottleneck, the Great Flood. According to the math, this happened roughly 4,700 years ago. After the floodwaters receded, only 8 humans survived. That's Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Just 8 people left to repopulate the entire planet. Zhu Feng points out a massive geographical and historical contradiction here. We have 8 surviving people in the Middle East 4,700 years ago. Yet historical records show this sudden appearance of completely distinct, massive global populations right around the exact same time. Take the story of Dayu controlling floods in the ancient Chinese Empire. That was roughly 4,200 years ago. How could descendants of Noah reach China in just a few centuries and multiply enough to form a whole empire? And what about Native Americans, who are completely separated by massive oceans?
It creates a severe paradox. The author highlights that without biological evolution, there is absolutely no logical way to explain how 8 people could repopulate and diversify across distant continents so quickly. But if you do accept rapid evolution to explain all this diversity, you're essentially denying the biblical creation story. It's an inescapable logical trap.
And now, part 5, the final verdict. We need to test those remaining traits from our rubric, specifically focusing on impartiality and mystery. Let's look at Cain and Abel. Both brothers brought offerings to God, right? Well, God accepted Abel's offering, but inexplicably rejected Cain's. By showing this kind of unexplained favoritism, the author argues that God acted with pure partiality, which directly provoked the jealousy that led to the very first murder in human history.
Furthermore, Xufeng critiques the highly unusual morality that happens next. After Cain kills Abel, he isn't struck down. Instead, the text says anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Talk about a divine witness protection program. The author asks, why is the creator offering a 7-fold protection plan to a murderer? How does protecting a criminal align with supreme justice and impartiality?
Finally, we look at mystery versus supreme intelligence. Xufeng wonders why a truly supreme intelligence would obscure its messages through confusing dreams and vague prophets, instead of making the truth clear and straightforward. If your goal is to guide humanity, why not communicate directly? Relying on human prophets, who could easily misunderstand or deceive others, shows either an inability to communicate, a lack of time, or simply that the deity has something to hide. So, reviewing those 8 traits again, the author's conclusion is absolute. Based on the textual evidence of the Bible itself, Xufeng argues the Old Testament God decisively fails the rubric. He lacks impartiality with Cain and Abel, lacks mercy in the 10 plagues, lacks supreme intelligence in the Garden of Eden, and lacks foresight regarding the human timeline. Therefore, according to the author, this deity simply cannot be the greatest creator.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. The text leaves us with a profound, paradigm-shifting final thought to chew on. If the God promoted in the Old Testament is not the greatest creator, then who or what actually is? It's a massive, truly unsettling question, and exactly the kind of deep dive we love unpacking here. Keep questioning the world around you, and thanks for joining me.